Hi everyone. This recipe was developed during the Depression era when apples were not readily available. It comes together almost like magic, and it's a mock apple pie that has no apples in it. It was developed when apples were not readily available during the Depression. So if you need to make apple pie and you only have shelf-stable ingredients, this is the way to make it. As you can tell, it looks very much like an apple pie would, but instead of apples, we're going to be using Ritz crackers. And if you don't want to use Ritz crackers specifically, store brand would work just fine. You're going to start out with your crust ingredients, and that's going to be 6 ounces or a cup of flour, plus some flour for rolling out your crust, 6 tablespoons of butter, an ounce of shortening, a half teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons of sugar, 1/4 cup of ice water. You want that to be very cold, and then optional 1 to 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. Then for your filling, you're going to want 2 cups of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar, 1 3/4 cup of water, 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, 36 Ritz crackers, 2 tablespoons of butter, and some cinnamon. And then we're going to do a crumble topping for that, which is going to be a cup of flour, a cup of sugar, and then a stick of salted butter. If you will notice, all of these things are pretty much shelf stable. You can use margarine for this if you don't want to use butter. It doesn't make a huge difference. You can also use fresh lemon juice or bottled lemon juice. I used bottled just because that's cheaper and it tends to be more shelf stable as well. So the first thing you're going to do is weigh your flour into the bowl. This is always going to be more accurate than measuring by cups, and for pie crust that's going to be really helpful. First, you're going to put your bowl in there, hit the tare measure, and then weigh it in there. You're going to add your salt and sugar into your flour and mix that in a little bit just so that you're not having to stir any more than you absolutely have to. Then we are going to grate your cold butter into the flour mixture. I'm using a very small grater. This is going to mean that we don't have to work the butter a whole lot. This is a trick that helps you with breaking it up and not having to use your fingers a whole lot to break up the butter pieces. You want the butter as cold as possible and the pieces of the butter as small as possible. So if you don't have one of these little tiny graters and you want to just use a regular grater, use the smallest side of the grater. This is going to help your pie crust be flaky, and the fat is going to separate your starch granules so that all of your flour is not going to get very tough. Some people use the food processor for this process, but this is a whole lot less dishes than using a food processor, so I just prefer this method. It does take a little bit to grate it. And it gets very fluffy. Then I toss it a little bit with the flour just to get it coated together. You want to work this as little as possible just because we don't want that butter to melt. Then we are going to weigh in your shortening, so hit your tare weight again. And we are weighing in 1 ounce of shortening. So now we are going to be putting our water in, but before we do that, we want to use the tips of your fingers to work your shortening and flour into the mix. This works a lot better if you have cold fingers, and I have always had very cold fingers. You want this to end up being about the size of peas. We are using the biscuit method for this. It's the same method you would use for biscuits or scones, but instead of getting it to the size of breadcrumbs or cornmeal, you are looking for it to be a little bit larger and be the size of peas. This process is called cutting in and is key to the biscuit method. So you're doing this before you add in any of your liquid. Before I start working in the shortening and the butter, though, I always do get the water ready because I don't want to have to wash my hands a whole lot of times. If your hands do tend to be very hot, you might want to do this with a fork or a pastry blender. I am not a huge fan of pastry blenders, but my hands are cold. So if this is something that you're going to be doing often, it might be worth it for you to invest in a pastry blender. You're going to work this as little and as quickly as possible to keep your butter from melting. And I just kind of take my fingers and rub them together as you're seeing on the screen and just kind of toss the flour and work those little pieces of butter in. You are going to add the vanilla to your ice water before you add it to the mixture and mix it with a little whisk. Especially since this is vanilla bean paste and doesn't mix in very well. Then you are going to want to sprinkle your water over the flour mixture and get it over as much of the flour as you possibly can. And this is so we are not going to have to work this very much at all. We don't want to have a tough pie crust in the end. And so we are getting it over the top of all the flour. You're going to mix in the water until it's evenly mixed. It still is going to be a little bit crumbly. That's okay. We're going to be putting this in the refrigerator to hydrate, and it will hydrate and come together in the fridge. So mix it as little as you can. We do not want this to be tough. We do not want people to have to chew that pie crust a whole lot. And so just a little tossing, a little bit of mixing together. Make sure you get all that flour from the bottom and scoop that up, and you're good to go. Then you are going to take some plastic wrap and lay it on the counter. And then turn the dough onto the plastic wrap. And as you can see from the look of it, it does not look like it is going to come together. It looks messy. It looks shaggy. It does not look like what you think a dough should look like. That is fine. Trust the process. You're going to use the plastic wrap to form the dough into a disc, and then we're going to refrigerate it for 30 minutes. The fridge is going to do some magic for us. It is going to let the water soak into the dough. That is called hydrating. That will help us out a lot. So while that dough is hydrating, we are going to make our filling mixture. After 30 minutes, we're going to remove the dough from the wrap and flour the board, flour the top of the dough, and roll it into a long oval. You're going to turn it 90 degrees and roll it into a round. You want to check and make sure it's not sticking to the board, and continue rolling in both directions until it's large enough to cover your pie plate. Then you're just going to carefully lift that up and lay it over top of your pie plate. And you might have some areas that are not completely covered. You're just going to use some dough from your overhang to patch those areas. It is not a huge deal. This is a homemade pie, and that is what is beautiful about it. Then you're just going to pull that dough from the edges Make sure your dough is pressed all the way to the bottom. You are going to dot the bottom of the pie dough with a fork. This is going to keep it from getting bubbles in it. Then we're going to place some parchment over the dough and put some beans in there. This is also going to keep it from rising up. And we're going to bake it at 350 for 15 minutes. This is going to make sure that the dough does not get too soggy when we put the filling in. So while this is baking, if you could hit that subscribe button, that helps our channel out a whole lot. So now we're going to be working on our filling. So you're going to put your sugar and cream of tartar in a saucepan on the stove and mix those two things together. Then you are going to slowly stir in that 1 3/4 cup of water. Then bring that up to a boil. And that will take about 5 minutes to get it to a boil. And have your temperature on high. And then once it comes to a boil, you'll set a timer for 5 minutes. And boil it for 5 minutes. And then turn your heat off and let it cool for 30 minutes. Then we can work on making our crumble filling for the top, or crumble topping. You're going to add some sugar to flour in a small bowl. And then we're going to work some softened butter into the sugar flour mixture until it gets crumbly. And once it gets crumbly, you're good to go. Then you're going to place your pie shell on a sheet pan, just so that if anything overflows, you're not going to get it in the bottom of your oven. And you're going to lightly crumble your Ritz crackers into the shell. You don't want them to be any smaller than about crumbled in half. Keep in mind that this is about the size that your apples would be if you were making an apple pie. And this is 36 Ritz crackers, which I found out that a sleeve of Ritz crackers is 33. And then you're going to pour the sugar syrup over top of the crackers. And then you're going to take that butter for the filling and cut it into small pieces over top of the syrup and Ritz crackers. And then sprinkle your cinnamon over top of your butter and crackers. And then you're going to sprinkle your crumble topping over top of that. The original Ritz cracker recipe had you using a pie crust on top, but I like my apple pie with a crumble on top, and this ended up being really, really good. So you're going to cover your edges of this with foil to prevent those edges from burning because they are already baked. And then you're going to bake it for 30 to 35 minutes until it's no longer wobbly. It did take the full 35 minutes. And before you eat it, you're going to want it to be completely cool because it is pretty liquidy. And you want to store it in the refrigerator. I was not expecting this pie to work, but it ended up being my favorite pie that I've had in quite a while. And it's kind of funny to think about the fact that a pie that has no apples in it tastes completely like an apple pie. So I highly recommend that you try this. It is a great way if you don't have apples around to make an apple pie, and it's a fun way to try something with your friends. Let us know in the comments if this is something that you'd like to try, and hit that like button, comment, and definitely subscribe because we are trying to build this channel up, and we will see you guys next week.